Hello everybody and welcome to another Batman 1966 review. Today it is Season 1, Episode 7, Instant Freeze. And if you couldn't tell by the title, this episode introduces us to another very famous Batman villain, Mr. Freeze, who is played by George Sanders in this episode. And I do consider George Sanders to be a great actor, but I did think this was kind of an interesting casting choice, but it works out okay. Mr. Freeze is a little bit more of a serious villain than some of our previous villains like the Joker and the Riddler, so the casting makes sense and it works out okay. So this episode's pretty solid all the way around. It's a nice introduction to part 2 as usual. So we open with some henchmen who melt the Gotham ice rink apparently. And then they get away on an icy road. So this leads us to the conclusion that Mr. Freeze must be behind this. And I do like the next scene. Batman is very familiar with Mr. Freeze. We learn a few facts about him. And that he needs certain temperatures to survive. And we also learn that Batman apparently caused an accident that made Mr. Freeze like this, which I like. It makes the story a little more personal in that regard. Makes it a little more complex. I appreciated that. So it's deduced basically that Mr. Freeze needs a certain amount of money to maintain the condition that he needs. And at this point, we're basically introduced to Mr. Freeze. Once again, a little bit later in the episode than I would like, but it's fine. And I do have to mention there's some interesting effects. In Mr. Freeze's lair, there's basically these sections that are hot areas for the henchmen and other people to survive. And they're done in kind of all red, which is very interesting. You just got to kind of watch it, but I thought it worked pretty well. Probably the best thing they could have done in the 60s as a contrast. I thought that was fine. We're also introduced to these Batman and Mr. Freeze clones, which are kind of interesting, but don't really add a ton to the plot, but they're kind of cool, I guess. So the basic plot of this isn't very original. It's to steal some diamonds. And we get another classic Batman fight when Batman figures this out, and it's a pretty entertaining one. And I have to say we're also introduced to the freezing effects, and they're okay. They're a little bit odd. They're not what I would have expected, but they do work. For 1960s TV, I would give them a pass. I would say they're okay. Partway through this episode, we're also introduced to this princess, which seems a little bit contrived as Mr. Freeze wants to steal some diamonds from her. It appears the first theft attempt was a mislead, as often seems to be the case in these Batman episodes that have multiple plots. Sometimes I think it would be a little more effective if they just focused on one plot, but they seem to like to have multiple plots, so that's fine. So at this point, Mr. Freeze does come for the princess to steal the diamonds, and of course Batman and Robin are there, but we get our cliffhanger of the episode as Mr. Freeze actually does freeze them. So now the cliffhangers seem to be getting upped every time. First we had Robin in peril, then Bruce Wayne. Now we've got Batman and Robin both in peril at the end of the episode. So overall, this is another solid first of 2 episodes, Instant Freeze, and I give it a 3.5 out of 5. An effective setup for part 2, but this time, unfortunately, I don't think part 2 is quite as strong as part 1. But this episode's solid, and I give Instant Freeze a 3.5 out of 5. And as always, thank you very much for watching.